over is going to be, if you have a high IQ, are you going to be missed for having a diagnosis for ADHD? And if you have a diagnosis for ADHD, are you possibly going to be missed for having a high IQ? And then if you have both, I wonder what that is. And so I found this article in Tulsa Kids, which is really interesting, tulsakids.com, written by Mary Beth Ritchie. And she's a clinical social worker. And so I wanted to go over what she said and then go over everything that I know as well. Now, keep in mind, not a doctor, but this is just stuff I read, research, all that kind of stuff. But before I get into that, if you like this video, if you are listening to the podcast and like this episode, go ahead and click the subscribe button on either platform. And then also, if you're on YouTube, click the notification bell so that you get notified every time I put out a new episode, and leave a like and a comment. Okay, with all that being said, let's get into it. Okay, let's talk about IQ and ADHD. And the first thing I want to say is this: your IQ doesn't have anything to do with ADHD in the correlation of that if you have ADHD, you can't be a smart person. Has nothing to do with that. If you have ADHD, you can be brilliant. And that is one of the things that I love about it, is that ADHD does not affect your intelligence. It just is something different, that you think different. And so when you think different, there is a lot that comes with that, whether it's good or bad, it just depends. And then it also will affect your life in specific ways. Now, if you're gifted, then it's also going to affect your life in different ways. Now, I want to bring up what the article says because it's very important to see what other people are saying, not just me. Again, I'm not a doctor, so I want you to see what a clinical social worker has to say. I think it's very interesting, so I'm going to bring that up right now. And what it says here is ADHD affects individuals of all intellectual abilities. Again, very important, all intellectual abilities right here. And so one might think that children with a high IQ would be able to better manage the struggle with ADHD symptoms. Instead, they may have their own struggles. So that is very interesting as well. It says children with ADHD are often socially behind their peers. They are most comfortable with children several years younger. On the other hand, exceptionally bright children are often most comfortable with children several years older. The child with both ADHD and high IQ may be comfortable with both older and younger children, but be socially awkward with their peers. Now, that talks about two things. That talks about the social awkwardness if you have a high IQ and if you have ADHD. And I think that would be very interesting to see someone like that, to know someone like that. I know people have ADHD, but I have no idea what their IQ is. I don't go up to a person and be like, hey, I know you have ADHD. What's your IQ? I don't do that, right? I don't think anybody does that, right? But if you happen to just know someone who is really intelligent and maybe, is a doctor or an advanced position or whatever it is, and then find out they have ADHD, then you kind of look at them and say, I wonder how they are socially. And you can probably see that over time, just looking at them and interacting with them, how they are. Now, I also know a lot of people with ADHD, and yes, generally, if you have ADHD, you like to be around people who are younger, just because of the fact that, hey, you have more fun when you're younger. You have more fun when you're younger. And I'm not saying people with high IQ do not have fun, but I know people with ADHD do have a lot of fun. And so that's great because they can also be the life of the party sometimes, just from their personality. And that's the other thing. So if you have ADHD and are gifted, I don't know if that kind of makes you in the middle. And then that's why you are socially awkward, right? Not sure how that works out. But anyway, here is the point that all this says, is that it doesn't matter how smart you are. You can have ADHD. And you can see that even if you're gifted with ADHD, you don't handle ADHD any better in that case just for being gifted, because it has nothing to do with your intellect. Okay, let's look at something else, because I want to go over what's said in this article about a child growing up with ADHD and being gifted and vice versa. And so I think this is a really good quote. I want to just go ahead and click it right here and bring it up so you can see it. What it says here, children who are intellectually gifted usually do recognize that they are smart. So a child knows. When they are young, school is often quite easy for them, and they do exceptionally well in the early grades. Parents and teachers also recognize their intelligence, and they hold these children to high expectations. As school becomes progressively more difficult, ADHD symptoms become more of a problem. As a third grade teacher, I can tell you that this may be the year children and parents begin to notice problems. By third grade, school becomes more challenging. Students are expected to become more independent. Academics may begin to suffer and progressively become worse during the next years. This may be confusing to the child who has found things to come so easily in the past. Children might begin to doubt themselves, which lead to experiencing anxiety. Parents and teachers may become disappointed in the child. They may attribute the lack of scholastic success to laziness, boredom, lack of effort. In fact, the ADHD symptoms may be contributing to academic difficulties. So, I think it's very interesting article because of the fact I think that's a very interesting situation because it shows how it can be when you're a child and you're gifted, or your child when you're growing up with ADHD, and you get to that third grade, and now things become more difficult. And so now, as a child, you're trying to figure things out, but your parents are like, well, maybe he's just lazy, or you're in that would be bad for a parent to say. I'm not saying a parent would say that, but that's what the article says. And so, or maybe the teacher just thinks that they're lazy and not, the child's lazy and not doing their work. And if you grew up with ADHD, maybe you have experienced this, right? Maybe you experienced this ridicule, or maybe you have experienced this growing up as you're in class. And so I think it's really interesting to see that at some point you're expected to be more independent, and this says right around the third grade. And if you can't be that because you have ADHD, then it says right there you're going to create this anxiety, and then you're going to just do, I would guess, if you have anxiety on top of everything else that you're dealing with, you're going to do worse in school. And so then your grades will start to slip and stuff like that. So I think it's a very interesting perspective on it and story to let you understand how it can be if you have ADHD, you're gifted and you're growing up, and the expectations that people have of you once they find out that you're gifted, or just expectations in general when you're going to school and parents find out that you're having a difficult time, teachers find out that you're having a difficult time, and you're just not turning in assignments and things like that, or you're just not paying attention during class. So now we're going to get into more of the subject of misdiagnosis, right? And again, not a doctor, but I'm just going to talk about because this is what the article says. And the fact that if you have ADHD, you might be misdiagnosed, and if you have a high IQ, you might be misdiagnosed. And I'm going to go back to the article here and see what they say. And what they say here is misdiagnosis is not uncommon when you have a high IQ and ADHD collide. Very bright children who are also highly active are sometimes misdiagnosed with ADHD. On the other hand, some intelligent children with ADHD can focus on things that interest them for an extended period of time, which can lead to misdiagnosis as well. The result is these children often don't receive treatment they need. And so I want to bring, I guess, some clarification to that. I think what she's talking about is hyperfocus. Now, again, she said highly intelligent children with ADHD. And I know she's talking about gifted children, but I also want to make sure that you know the fact that with hyperfocus, anyone with ADHD can click into hyperfocus. And not in the fact that they can just go, hey, I want to hyperfocus. Okay, I'm hyperfocused now. No, it can't. That doesn't happen. What happens is anyone with ADHD will find something that they really are interested in, and then somehow, some way, the brain kind of kicks in and says, okay, you're going to stay on that thing. You're going to focus on that thing for minutes or hours or whatever it is. And so you get hyper focused in. It's like this laser focus. And so people say, well, people with ADHD can't focus. That's not true. If it's interesting, if it works on an interest-based learning system, right? And that's how people with ADHD function. And so if they find something that's interesting to them, like super interesting, they'll get hyper-focused on it. And hyperfocus is very interesting to see because parents will be like, well, he can focus or she can focus on that video game for hours on end. And that may be true because now the child has gotten into the hyperfocus on it. Like, this is really interesting, so I'm just going to put all my attention on it. Or it could be something like, hey, you're going to read this book and you just decide to hyperfocus on whatever is in the subject of the book. And you just read the book for hours and hours on end, not realizing anything else around in your environment. So, not that you couldn't hear something going off, or or it's, something burning or whatever, right? If you're in a house, you're going to hear the fire alarm. But not to that extent. What I mean is that you just don't pay attention to your environment as much because you're super focused on this one thing. Okay, so here's another thing that I think is really interesting that she says that I would never have thought of. Um, Really interesting here. It says, how can you tell if your child's intellectually gifted, has ADHD, or both? This can be a challenging because the two share commonalities. Children in both groups often have high energy levels and low tolerance for boredom. They are frequently curious, creative, and may enjoy high risk activities. Both can display resistance to authority, albeit for different reasons. Both groups may struggle academically. Children in both groups may also seem uncomfortable with their same age peers. Now, here's something I thought that was really, really, really interesting that she also said too. So there are some signs to look for. If you're wondering if your child has a significantly high IQ. She says, did your child begin to lie by the age of 5? It says lying involves clever skills which many children haven't developed by that age. And so I thought that was just really interesting. She has some other things here too. Did your child have trouble getting to going to sleep at a reasonable hour around the age of 8? Does your child love to read? These can also be signs of high intelligence. And so, but I thought the most interesting thing is she said that if your child is lying by the age of 5, that means they're highly intelligent. I don't want my child to lie by the age of 5. I don't want my child lying at all. But throughout life, kids are gonna lie. People are gonna lie, right? So, but the thing about it is, I don't know that you want your child learning to lie earlier than other kids. But I guess as a sign of intelligence, I would never have thought about that. I never have thought, okay, my child's lying by the age of 5. They're super intelligent. I just wouldn't I wouldn't bring the two together as highly intelligent and lying, right? I would have never have thought that. Like if my child's lying by the age of 5, I would never have thought, okay, lying and intelligence go completely together. I mean, I guess I've seen people on TV shows and all that kind of thing, like these evil masterminds or whatever, that have like put this plan together. And of course, through all that, they have to do a lot of lies. And I guess those people are intelligent on those little TV shows or whatever. Or in the movie, you see the criminal master villain or whatever it is. And so highly intelligent, lying all the time, right? But just thinking about a kid who is not yet or just about the age of 5, or a little bit over the age of 5, figuring out how to lie and, relating that to intelligence, right? And she also brought out some of the commonalities, and I want to go over that real quick and show you what the commonalities are. And they are right here. It says, how can you tell if your child is gifted or ADHD or both? This can be a challenge between the two because they share commonalities. Children in both groups often have high energy levels and a low tolerance for boredom. They are frequently curious, creative, and enjoy high-risk activities. Both can also display a resistance to authority. Albeit for some reasons both groups may struggle academically, children in both groups may also seem uncomfortable with their same age peers. So I thought it was really interesting. Even if you have a gifted child or that child's gifted, then you can still struggle academically because a child is bored. If they're in one grade and they're like, I can do this in my sleep kind of thing because they're super intelligent, and they get bored, they're not going to do well in school because they're bored. There's nothing to challenge them. So why are they sitting in this class and they're kind of like, I know how to do this already, but you will not let me go to the next class so I can keep learning. You're just having me in this class and I get bored. As opposed to if you have ADHD, you might just get bored because it's not interesting. You might say, not interested, I'm bored. Let me know when you get to something that's interesting and then I'll come back. Or you just space out and come back, and then not realize where where the teacher is at in the subject and be like, okay, I don't know, and I'm just going to space back out. But it both correlates, right? Boredom and boredom. And that may be why they struggle, or they're both highly energetic, highly active. Both may struggle with friends and relating to their peers because people who are gifted like to hang out with the older people, and people who have ADHD like to hang out with the younger people. So they're going to struggle trying to figure that out and find their place when they are in class, in class and growing up. And it may be the same thing now when you're an adult. You may struggle because of the fact that you may like to hang out with older peers if you are gifted and highly intelligent, as opposed to if you have ADHD, you might enjoy hanging out with younger crowd, younger people. But society would just call that you are young at heart. Go out and be yourself and be young at heart. That can be a good thing when you get to the older age, obviously, 40s, 50s, things like that. The people will start to say you're young at heart and look at that as a good thing. But if you're in your 20s, then they may not view that as such of a good thing because you're trying to make sure that you're growing up to be more mature as you get into your 20s, and people want to see that, right? Anyway, that is a tangent, but I want to say this. It's just very interesting looking at both high IQ and ADHD, how the commonalities can show themselves. And I thought that was one of the most interesting things about this subject, is seeing the commonalities between the two, and then seeing how they can affect your life and how you might have experienced things growing up as a child. So I think it's very, very interesting to look at both of those things. And looking at the article one more time, I want to go over the traits that they have here. And I think it was a really interesting list. I wanted to show you that real quick because the list is interesting. And it says the National Association for Gifted Children asserts that no gifted individual is exactly the same, which is awesome, right? If you are gifted, if you have ADHD, you're not the same as anybody else. Just you're the individual person, whether you have ADHD, whether you're gifted now. They say there are many traits that gifted individuals have in common, but not every child exhibits the trait that is also the same with ADHD. Here are some things that they talk about. It says an interest in problem solving, voracious and early reader, keen sense of humor, intensely focused on passions, highly energetic needs, little sleep or downtime, critical thinker, diverse interests and abilities, impulsive, eager, and spirited, high expectations of self and others often lead to frustration, sensitivity and empathy for others, volatile temper, especially related to perceptions of failure, non-stop talking and chattering. Now, the last one here is definitely a thing that ADHD has. You might, if you have ADHD, you might notice that, yeah, you talk a lot. And that's not saying it's bad, just saying that it might be something you notice about yourself or someone else who has ADHD. And looking at this, they're very similar, but I want to bring your attention to one thing that I think is really good. It says, check with your child's doctor if you're concerned, since most healthy children are inattentive, hyperactive, or impulsive at one time or another. It's typical for preschoolers to have a short attention span, and the same can be true in older children and teens. Now, I think that's very interesting. I think this applies to adults too. I don't mean that adults like hyperactive, inattentive, whatever. What I'm kind of drawn to point to is this: is that everybody has some of the things that go on with ADHD. Whether doesn't matter what kind of person you are, you all everybody deals with some things that go on with ADHD, right? It's not uncommon for people to lose their keys, not uncommon for somebody to forget things, it's not uncommon for someone to get distracted sometimes. But the thing that you have to understand about ADHD is that it is the frequency when those things happen, and also how much it affects someone's life. And that is why ADHD is a diagnosis, right? And that's what you'll find out when you look into, anything related to like a diagnostic manual, or anything related to asking a doctor, why is this a diagnosis? And they'll tell you based on the frequency, based on how much it affects your life. And those are really why there is a diagnosis for ADHD. And so I just want to make that clear that it's really saying that same thing there. Not in the direct way, but my point is that children can all have those same things going on. Adults a lot of times can have the same things going on, but it's really about how much they affect your life, how much those things affect their life. In the case of children, you have the hyperactivity and other things, and parents may just say, "Oh, that's my child. They're just being a kid." They don't see any difference in between their kid and some other kid until they really start to notice things, right? until they start to see how much those things affect their own kid. So people the same way in life are not going to notice that you have ADHD until they see how much it affects your life, until they see how frequently it happens. With a kid, you're doing the same thing. You're looking to see how frequently they might be doing these things and how much it affects what they do during the day. And so those things I think correlate pretty well. So just think about that, maybe look at that and think about that and see, does that make sense to you? Okay, the other thing I'm going to go over are the traits that they say here for ADHD. And here they are right here. It's very to pay close attention. Details are careless mistakes, have trouble focusing on task at play, appear not to listen, avoid or dislike tasks that require focused mental effort, such as homework, forget to do daily activities, fidget, tap, or squirm, in constant motion, have trouble playing or doing quiet activities, talk too much, blurt out answers, interrupt or intrude on others' games or conversations. And so, as you can see, a lot of the symptoms or traits of ADHD and the traits of giftedness really do seem like the same. And so you can see that it can be very easy to not really notice if someone has ADHD or if someone has a high IQ. What do you think about all this? I hope that you have enjoyed the podcast, whether you're listening on a podcast app or watching this on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then I have my podcast, audio version of this podcast, in the description below that you can use if you want to go listen to the audio. And if you're listening to this on the podcast app, I also have my YouTube channel in the description on that, or the notes on that as well. So if you want to do either version, then the link is already there for you to click. All right, thanks for listening and have a great day.